Meeting tonight. All right, on to our speaker. We're very excited about our speaker. She is a public historian and preservationist who got her bachelor's degree in history from the College of Charleston in South Carolina, where she was part of the opening of the McLeod Plantation. This is a Sea Island cotton plantation, and she was part of a group that interpreted the enslaved people who spoke Gullah Geechee. This is the spoke Gullah. This is the culture of the Gullah Geechee culture. She was part of the interpretation of this museum down in South Carolina. Fortunately for us, she moved up here to the Washington, D.C. area where she worked for the National Park Service. She was a park ranger. She got to wear the hat. Everybody loves the hat. Then she went on to work for the Smithsonian, where she was part of the opening of the African American Museum. So she helped open the McLeod Plantation House. She also helped open the African American Smithsonian, so she's definitely the person you want to go to when you're opening something new. From there, she went on to be the director of the Lee-Fendall House here in Old Town. Then she moved on to the Woodlawn Pope-Leighey House. So she's obviously got a great resume, and she's been working in public history and preservation for quite some time. She is currently a research fellow at the George Washington Presidential Library, where she is studying the history of women in preservation, which is the topic of her speech today. Welcome to the stage, Amanda Roper.
All right, first one of the season, always a few kinks. But yeah, so excited to be here with you all this evening. My name is Amanda Roper, and I am gonna be sharing with you a little bit of my research that is going into the book I'm writing about women in preservation and the pivotal role that women have played in saving so much of our history here in the United States. But I do wanna sort of start out by saying, posing the question, why women in preservation? Why am I writing this book? If you want to forward the slide, women have been and continue to be such important keepers of stories, objects, and places of cultural significance. And they've saved so many of America's most well-known parks, battlefields, neighborhoods, and cities, as well as local history sites. And early preservation efforts really centered on saving the homes of what were considered important Americans in an attempt to create a sort of more unified narrative of our past. You know, we're a young country just after the Revolution. And so a lot of the early women in preservation are trying to foster this spirit of patriotism for the new nation. Preservation became really a socially acceptable way for women to engage in civic matters outside of the home. And women used this to increase their social and political influence over time. Now, of course, women's involvement in preservation has changed and expanded as the field has become more professionalized in the 20th century, and motivations for saving historic sites have also evolved, reflecting the desire to include more voices and save places that reflect the complexity of American history. So in my talk tonight, I'm going to be sharing a few of the key stories and women that have shaped preservation in America, but I'm really going to be emphasizing a couple of sites here in Alexandria. So, of course, because Alexandria is such an important place. So if you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start out, of course, by taking us back to 1776. It is that year. The oppressive July heat had settled on Philadelphia, and 14-year-old Deborah Norris listened to the words of the Declaration of Independence being read aloud in the city's streets. Standing behind the fence surrounding her family's home near Independence Hall, she grasped the momentousness of the occasion better than many in the crowd that day, whom she described as not the most sober or reflecting. Years later, when she recounted this moment in her diaries, Deborah understood the interest that future generations would have in the people and the places that witnessed this founding period of American history. So Deborah is part of this early group of women in preservation who understands that it's important to start saving the stories of America's early history. So she's sort of part of that really coming of age after the Revolutionary War, that post-Revolutionary War generation. And for many of the women who are involved in preserving history in this generation, the work really starts at home. So she keeps, of course, very extensive diaries throughout her life, which are a great record of her life and her contributions. But she also married into the Logan family of Philadelphia. So these were Quaker families, of course, in Philadelphia. She marries into the Logan family. So she marries the grandson of James Logan, who had been a secretary to William Penn, Pennsylvania's colonial founder. And so she realizes that there are these letters between Logan and Penn in the family's possession. And she wakes up early in the mornings before the household is up, and she is transcribing and editing, and eventually the letters between the two are published because of her efforts. And she is preserving the Logan family home in Philadelphia known as Stenton. So she preserves not only the structure, but she's also working to preserve the furnishings, the library there, and she's even loaning out some of the chairs that William Penn apparently sat on for various exhibitions. So she's very actively involved in not only saving documents and the building, but material culture as well. And so many of the women are responsible for doing this at this time. And it really, the work that Deborah is doing, it really fits in with sort of the gender expectations of this time period. Historians often use the term Republican motherhood to describe the expectation that women in early America were expected to sort of raise and educate that next generation of patriots. So their work really starts at home in that domestic sphere. And so she is using that, and she talks a lot about the being this mother, or passing on these ideals and these ideals of the revolution to the next generation and training them up. So she's very concerned with history and posterity. And she is able, like I said, to preserve a lot of Pennsylvania's early history. She becomes the first woman elected to membership in the Pennsylvania Historical Society. So quite an influential and important woman in this early period of American history. If you want to move the slide forward, you can see in the background of the image behind me Stenton, which still stands in Philadelphia. Stenton, of course, is a historic house museum today. It was actually opened in 1900 as a museum by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of Pennsylvania. But the reason this house is still standing and the reason it was able to be opened as a museum to the public really goes back further than Deborah and her time there. It goes back again to the 1770s when Dinah, who was a woman that was formerly enslaved by the Logan family at Stenton, she returned after receiving her freedom in 1776, and she returns to work at Stenton as a housekeeper for the remainder of her life. She is credited with saving Stenton from being burned by British troops in 1777. And I think Dinah's story is a really important one in my research, because it really posed the question in my mind, who counts as a preservationist? I think today a lot of us see preservationists as professionals, as architectural historians, right, as people who do this for a living. But how often do the people who perform the daily and physical acts of care for these historic buildings not get credited as preservationists? And I would argue for a much broader definition of preservationists, that we all have a part to play in preserving our history. And I'm going to move us on from Philadelphia to Boston. So the Bunker Hill Battlefield and Monument is sort of credited as the first example of women coming together as a group and being involved in historic preservation. And so what we're seeing in this example are women from the New England region, mostly from around Boston, who are coming together to really finish a job that the men started. So in the early 19th century, it was seen that as a man's role to raise funds for public monuments. And the construction on the Bunker Hill Monument actually started in 1825. In fact, the Marquis de Lafayette, one of his last sort of acts on his farewell tour, was laying the cornerstone for the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. But for about 15 years, no progress was made in terms of building the monument or in terms of raising enough funds to secure the surrounding battlefield lands. So by 1840, the land was actually at risk of being sold off. And so a group of women, they decide that they are going to get together. Most of them are members of local clubs in New England, and they hold a fundraising fair. So they're creating crafts and arts to sell. And in a short span of 5 days, they bring in more than the original goal of $30,000 needed to complete the monument. So I often think about the Washington Monument here in DC and how much more quickly that could have been built if women had been involved in fundraising there. But like I said, it's often this battlefield monument and this early important battlefield in the Revolution really is one of the first examples where you see women using their skills, organizing their networks in order to secure this site for future generations. And one of the women who was involved in this preservation effort was Sarah Hale. So if you want to change the slide for me, you'll see Sarah Hale, you may be familiar with her because she very famously was the writer and editor of a number of magazines, the Godey's Ladies Book and the Ladies Magazine. And she had started her life in New Hampshire, raised in a family that really valued equality in education, so she had a good education. She started out her life as a school teacher, but she then turned to writing and editing, realizing that she could have a much greater influence in this sphere. Now, Sarah Hale's interesting because she definitely believed in opportunities for women, especially employment opportunities for women, but she wasn't necessarily pushing for other changes. She was not a supporter of women's suffrage, for example. She really did feel like women's work started in the home and through the work that they did, like the work that she did through her magazine. But what's interesting about Sarah is she also was a very ardent supporter of the first fundraising effort that was a nationwide effort for women. So she supported the efforts to save George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, in the 1850s. And you'll see letters between her and Anne Pamela Cunningham in the archive there at Mount Vernon. So if you want to change the slide, of course, you can't talk about women in preservation and not talk about Mount Vernon. Like I said, this is the first time that you see women coming together from across the country, north, south, east, west, and really using their skills and their determination to save Washington's home. And the story has become, almost legendary. I'm sure you've heard it before, but in 1853, the mother of Anne Pamela Cunningham, she is sort of passing by on the Potomac River in a boat. She sees Mount Vernon up on the banks, and she famously writes to her daughter a letter in which she says, "I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind, why was it that the women of his country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not?" And so this letter famously inspires Anne Pamela Cunningham, a young woman from the South, from South Carolina, to issue a call. And at first it is a regional effort. She issues a call to the ladies of the South to raise the funds to save Washington's home. But Anne Pamela Cunningham has the foresight to realize that she's going to need women from across the country. Now remember, of course, in the 1850s, we know the country is very divided. So Anne decides that this cause of saving Washington's home can become a unifying rallying point for the nation in the hopes that civil war could be possibly even avoided. So you see women coming together. A lot of the early vice regents, and you'll see a photograph behind me, Anne herself is actually the one who's sort of in the center seated looking at the Washington bust there. She's kind of looking at him. But you'll see some of the early vice regents as well. And these women came, a lot of them were descended from patriot leaders. Anne herself loved to downplay the fact that her family were loyalists during the Revolution. But she was able to enlist the help of New York's Mary Morris Hamilton, of course, who was the granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton, and many other prominent women from patriot families during the Revolution. And they're all coming together in the 1850s to try to save this property. And that's the whole story in of itself. There have been books written about it. But, the Civil War, by the time of the Civil War, the ladies had secured the property, but it was in a very massive state of disrepair. And obviously the war put things on hold. In fact, Anne went back to her family plantation in South Carolina and left Sarah Tracy, who was the secretary of the organization, really in charge of protecting this site during the Civil War. And that story is a very interesting one. She recounts her experiences. And of course, you have soldiers who are trying to come and pay their respects to Washington from both sides, because we're right in the thick of things here in Alexandria, as we know, during the Civil War. And so the ladies are trying to basically maintain Mount Vernon as this neutral spot. So they're trying to enforce this no guns on the property, no weapons on the property, no uniforms. So you would sometimes see soldiers wrapped in shawls because they're trying to cover up their uniforms, and they're visiting Washington's tomb and paying their respects from both sides. And of course, like I said, Anne Pamela Cunningham had a lot of foresight because she understood the importance of preserving the institutional history of the MVLA, the Mount Vernon ladies. So every letter, every scrap of paper with notes scribbled on it pretty much was kept and is still able to be seen and viewed today. That's my research fellowship at Mount Vernon. Of course, much of it was spent poring through some of these early records and understanding like that network of women across the country who are all working towards a common goal. And what's also interesting is that these ladies also understood the necessity of raising funds, not only to secure the property under their ownership, but also to pay for the ongoing restoration and preservation of not only the mansion where Washington lived and the tomb, but also the surrounding outbuildings and gardens. So there were some early figures, some men who proposed tearing down all of the outbuildings, but the ladies were like, no, that's a part of the story. It's a part of the environment in which Washington lived. And so we're grateful that the ladies had that vision for preserving the entire property. And if you want to change slides here, another important woman in the story of the preservation is Sarah Johnson. And her story is sort of one that has come into light more recent years. But Sarah Johnson had actually been enslaved by descendants of the Washington family at Mount Vernon prior to the Civil War. And like so many of the people that were at Mount Vernon, they had this important knowledge of what Mount Vernon was like. Whether or not they had been there in Washington's time, there were stories that had been passed down in their community of how Mount Vernon functioned, how it was operated in Washington's day. And so this group of formerly enslaved people at Mount Vernon become a great resource, a knowledge resource for the Ladies Association as they're working to restore the property. Sarah Johnson returns to work for the MVLA after the Civil War is over, after she is free, and she actually eventually becomes the head housekeeper in the mansion in the 1870s. And in the archives, there are scraps of wallpaper from the new room. And these are documented as having been saved by Sarah Johnson, and they are passed on to the superintendent, and that is how they were able to restore the original wallpaper in the new room to what it looked like in Washington's time. And again, Sarah Johnson, I don't think traditionally would have been recognized as a preservationist, but I would argue that she is an important part of this preservation story at Mount Vernon, not only for maintaining the mansion, of course, but also for maintaining the stories of her ancestors as well, and the people who would have lived and labored on the site. And of course, maintaining those stories, those connections to the past, even if those stories were not immediately or always recognized by the MVLA in their early years. But yeah, if you want to change slides, we're going to move forward in time here a little bit. So, by the late 19th century, you're really starting to see this proliferation of women's organizations across the country. And a lot of women's groups are also patterning themselves after Mount Vernon. And they are working to save historic properties, a lot of them historic homes, across the country. And you're seeing by the turn of sort of the 20th century, this new generation of women involved in preservation who are using preservation to advocate for additional influence in the public sphere. And they realize that by coming together, they can actually affect a lot of change and improve society as well. But in this time period, after the Civil War, there is a lot of tension between progress and tradition. So you're seeing women's groups that are supporting preservation, as well as using their platform to advocate for suffrage, for public education and social welfare. But you're also seeing preservation used as a tool to oppose not only industrialization and immigration, but also improve race relations in the country. So it's a time where women are using history in a way as sort of a political tool to sort of further the stories that they think are important to share, and that helps support some of the social changes that they want to see in society. And of course, a lot of the early women's associations and groups like the DAR and the NSCDA, the Colonial Dames, and the Federation of General Federation of Women's Clubs, a lot of these groups initially were founded and they excluded people who were viewed as outsiders. So African Americans and other racial and ethnic minority groups. And that, of course, has changed. But in the founding years, they were often exclusive. And this led to the development of separate groups and separate organizations, for example, like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And this group becomes involved with saving the home of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, of course, his home is located in Washington, D.C., and he lived in this home towards the end of his life from 1877 and to 1895. Now, this property was inherited by his widow, Helen Douglass, who worked with a lot of women, including particularly women who were members of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, to preserve this site as a landmark. And there were a lot of women, Black women, who saw it as essential to save sites like this as really monuments to their race. It was a point of pride. And so one of those women who led the efforts was Mary Talbert. And you'll often see in some of the early writings advocating for saving the home, it is referred to as the Mount Vernon of the colored race. So they are looking at what happened in Mount Vernon, and they're saying, we need to show that we can save this site, which is important to our people and our people's history, and of course is important to American history. So if you want to change the slide, you'll see Mary Burnett Talbert was very much an activist and a suffragist, an educator. She becomes president of the Association of Colored Women's Clubs towards the end of her life, but she is really pushing to, her big project is, while she's there, the restoration of the Frederick Douglass home, which is accomplished finally in 1922. So yeah, Cedar Hill was the home, and basically this, the preservation work that she's doing, like I said, she sees it as very tied in with the rest of the social activism that she is doing in terms of trying to bring better education to people, African-American people, as well as fighting for the right to vote and other things. So she sees it all as very interrelated, this preservation work, with the work that she is doing in a larger sense. And she really sees the effective preservation of the Cedar Hill as a way to prove how serious these women are about change and how much they are able to accomplish together. She eventually is elected a president for life to the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association. Like I said, was really seen as really the driving force behind saving that home. Today, the property, of course, is in the hands of the National Park Service, Definitely a very important site in our shared history. But I'm going to jump us down to Charleston because, of course, I'm going to be talking. I'm not going to leave out Charleston in the story again of preservation. And one of the people that I love to talk about is Susan Prinkle Frost, partly because she was responsible, part of the group of women that advocated for women to be admitted to the College of Charleston. So it's thanks to her that I was able to attend that school. But Susan Prinkle Frost she was a member of one of the old and very influential Charleston families. She was born into a family that by the time of this sort of post-Civil War era had become impoverished, if you will. They didn't have a lot of money, but they definitely had the name and they had the influence. Susan Prinkle Frost was essentially she liked to fight tradition a little bit in that she wasn't going to sort of maintain her place, maintain her silence. She was very much an outspoken advocate for many things, including historic preservation. That was really her passion project. But she becomes the first professional female realtor in Charleston at the turn of the century. And so she was also very involved with the suffrage movement, very active and very much a leader in the suffrage movement. But like I said, the cause that was dearest to her heart was historic preservation. And she goes on to found the first sort of community-based preservation organization in the country, the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings. But what I think that name of the organization doesn't really convey what Susan's philosophy was. It was very instrumental in shifting preservation away from saving just individual buildings to saving entire neighborhoods and cityscapes. So, for example, a lot of her work in Charleston was trying to save a whole neighborhood along Trad Street to rehabilitate those historic homes that had fallen into disrepair and really bringing them back into use as homes. And so she did a lot of work that eventually leads to things like a revolving fund that you see a lot in Charleston, where whole neighborhoods are able to be sort of preserved and restored through funding from preservation organizations. But she was also, part of this group of women that were part of what's known as the Charleston Renaissance. So you see that really this flourishing of art and culture and preservation that really did a lot to shape the view that people have of Charleston today, of course, of this beautiful old city with so much old architecture. And of course, Charleston has really capitalized on that in more recent years, but really creating this sort of romanticized vision of the past. But to her credit, Susan, although she was not, there definitely, you could argue she was gentrifying, if you will, a lot of these neighborhoods. She did understand the importance of saving structures. For example, not only the Hayward Washington House in Charleston, where Washington stayed when he visited, but also the structure next door, Catfish Row, which is an important part of African-American life as well in the city. So, again, she's trying to save, buildings and alleyways, not just individual structures that are important, but whole landscape, cultural landscapes. And thanks a lot to her efforts, Charleston becomes the first city in the nation to essentially have a zoning ordinance that included designated historic districts. And now we love to talk about historic districts. And of course, we have our own here in Alexandria, but the first was in Charleston. Of course, many other cities followed, including here in Alexandria, but also, of course, very famously in New Orleans and in Santa Fe. So all of these cities are really benefiting from this broader vision of preservation. So yeah, I'm going to talk about another Alexandria site, of course, and this is the Pope-Leighey House, which hopefully many of you have toured and visited. The story, of course, of this house is an interesting one. The house was originally built in a neighborhood, a suburb, if you will, in Falls Church, Virginia, and was designed for the Pope family as an affordable example of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, his Usonian style of architecture, where he was basically trying to make his architecture more affordable and replicable for middle-class families to be able to live in. Not his, his very famous commission houses were a lot more expensive. This one was meant to be more affordable, more livable for American families. And so the Pope family lived in the house after it was completed in 1940 for several years, but eventually the house was sold to Robert and Marjorie Leighey, who were a couple that purchased the house, and they were living in the home for a while, but by the 1960s, they realized that their house was actually in the midst of the the expansion, if you will, of Interstate 66. So essentially, they got a letter, telling them that Interstate was going to be going right through their living room. And Robert passes away before all of this this drama sort of comes to fruition. But essentially, the story goes that pretty soon after his death, or if not the day of his funeral, is when Marjorie gets that first letter telling her, you got to leave. We'll give you money, but you got to leave the house. And Marjorie was a very interesting woman in her own right. She was very active in her church. She was very artistic. She loved, particularly loved to plants and flower arranging, but she had been skeptical actually when they had first bought the house because it was so different from the sort of traditional Cape Cod houses that she was used to, and I think the hardest part really was the downsizing she had to do, get rid of all of that extra chinaware and everything, because this house is quite tiny. There's not a lot of storage space. If you know about Frank Lloyd Wright, there's no basement, there's no attic, there's really nowhere to store any of that what he considered unnecessary stuff that people accumulate. So yeah, she found that adjustment hard, but then as soon as she realized sort of the philosophy of the house, she instantly fell in love, and really the house became such an important part of her life. So she was distraught, as you can imagine, hearing that this house was going to be torn down. Now, of course, at the time that she's getting this notice about the house being destroyed, the house was only about 25 years old. It wasn't considered historic. It wasn't 50 years old. And so, she had a hard time. She was sort of wondering, how do I get attention on this house to save it? But she luckily was able to reach out to the right people. And she reached out to, one of the people she reached out to was the head of the Department of the Interior, and she is able to sort of bring together, and of course she works with the National Trust for Historic Preservation as well, which is a fairly new organization at the time, and they come to this agreement where they are going to move the structure and essentially rebuild the house on one of the National Trust's properties, actually the first site that was saved by the National Trust, Woodlawn, located, of course, here in Alexandria, Virginia. So the house is moved, and it is saved, thankfully. But because of this house and others that were almost lost, and some that were lost, this house helped to influence a lot of the leadership who were involved in basically writing and passing the National Preservation Act of 1966, particularly the language around how government building, for example, interstates and everything, how it really has to take into consideration places of cultural importance. And so this site, obviously a site of cultural importance. And really, you start to see, of course, in this period of time, as the federal government gets a lot more involved in legislating preservation, really what's considered the professionalization of the field, and employment by a lot of sites and by the government as well of women as architects, as historians, as archaeologists. You're seeing women enter the field of preservation as professionals. But we're going to move to, I think, there's Marjorie right there, of course. You can see her with all the bigwigs. She's signing over the house. She continues to live in the house until her death on site at Woodlawn, but it eventually, of course, becomes a property of the National Trust. Right, if you want to move forward. So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk how important women were in sort of creating this narrative around American history, and really in the early years of our country trying to create a sort of unified narrative of our past. But there were times, of course, that sometimes there was tension about which stories needed to be saved or deserved to be saved, which stories are an important part of our American history. And you really see women leading in the 20th century efforts to preserve sites that really reflected a more complete story of America's past. And for a lot of the women who were working to accomplish this, they were working to preserve sites that often held very deeply personal significance and even sometimes painful associations. And that is the case in the story of Sue Kunitomi Embry. Sue was actually, she was born in California. She was a young woman, I think around 18, 19 years old when World War II, of course, breaks out. She is incarcerated at Manzanar, alongside her whole family. Basically are forced from their homes, from their businesses in California, and are living in these concentration camps where they are being held. Many of them, for example, like Sue, were American citizens. They had been born, of course, in the United States, but their loyalty was questioned simply because of their Japanese ancestry. For Sue and others at Manzanar, this was a very painful chapter of their lives. It does take quite a while until Sue returns to the site at Manzanar. She actually attends the first pilgrimage to the site in 1969. But she becomes a founder of what's known as the Manzanar Committee, an organization that continues to hold annual pilgrimages to Manzanar, to the site, and that has been so important in preserving the stories of this place. And it's really, you see Sue credited from the Park Service and others with the fact that Manzanar was eventually designated as a National Historic Site in the 1990s. So it is thanks to her that it is preserved as a National Park Site today. And again, for Sue, this work was important not only because it was personal, but mainly because she wanted Manzanar to stand as a reminder of when our country has sort of failed to live up to its founding ideals. And she hoped that by preserving sites like Manzanar, this type of injustice that was suffered by Japanese Americans would not happen again to any other group. And that was her big motivation for saving the site. And you see this, like I said, with women across the country who are saving sites connected with indigenous histories as well. Latin American histories. But I'm going to end our story, because I have to, back in Alexandria. So if you want to, and then go ahead. And I want to end back at Mount Vernon, of course, with the story of Gladys Quander Tansel. Gladys was a descendant of the Quander family, of course, a very well-known family, African-American family in Alexandria, many of whom had once been enslaved at Mount Vernon. So Gladys was actually, one of her ancestors was Nancy Carter Quander. And so Gladys was actually hired as the first African-American interpretive guide at Mount Vernon in 1975. And it's interesting because oral histories have been recorded with her, and those also, of course, reside at Mount Vernon. And in the early years, I think she was very hesitant to talk much on tours about her family's, her ancestors and her family connection, because she was afraid of what that would mean for people coming to the site. I think maybe she was concerned about how they would view her, but also because she wanted to sort of prove herself as the first, African-American guide. She didn't, I guess, she was not certain what she could share. But over the years, of course, as the MVLA recognized the importance of sharing the full story of Mount Vernon and the people who were enslaved there, Gladys did a lot of work to bring her ancestors' stories to the forefront. And she actually led the first slave life tours in 1995 at Mount Vernon. And of course, she was very active in preserving African-American history here in Alexandria, was a founding member of Alexandria Society for the Preservation of Black Heritage. And the work that she did, she was, because she was she actually inherited a lot of the Quander family scrapbooks that her aunt had actually put together. So she had quite an archive of important family documents to contribute, but also that helped to, again, shed light on the Quander family and their connections to Mount Vernon. And of course, her efforts are ongoing. She has since passed, but the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon continue the efforts of telling their ancestors' story at the site. And again, that's the last story I'm going to share with you tonight, but I do want to sort of end with a little bit of a charge here. And again, it is posing that question of who is responsible for saving our past. I find when I go to do a lot of these talks that a lot of members of the public have come to see in recent decades preservation as something that is the work of the federal government or maybe local government to save our history. They sort of believe it's a government's responsibility. But then, of course, I get a lot of concern and questions during my talks from people who are concerned about the erasure of their history and the censorship of their history. And they ask, what can I do to make sure that this history that I care about is not erased? And I remind them, and by sharing these stories of these women, many of whom were not professionals, they were not politicians, they were simply citizen preservationists who worked to save the places and the stories that they felt were important. And I would say that the way we prevent our history from being censored is by embracing the responsibility that each of us has to preserve our shared past. And I hope that the stories of these women will inspire all of us to do that moving forward. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. All of you love history. Of course, get involved in your community as you have been doing. Support your local historical society, of course, and continue to work to preserve our shared past. So thank you so much for. And I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments and stories that you want to share, whatever. I always love to hear from audiences if, yeah. I don't know about that because I know there was a publication that was put out soon after the monument was completed finally, and I think in 1889, but I didn't remember seeing too many women recognized, but I'm not saying that she wasn't. She may have, no. I mean, she may have been a contributor, but like I said, what's funny about the monument, the Washington Monument, is that it really was the men still, they had their reins, right? Sort of, they weren't going to relinquish that. So as many of you probably know, it took decades and decades to finally complete. But yeah, that's to my knowledge, it probably would have been faster if maybe the women had taken over. But yeah, unfortunately that didn't happen. But there were definitely many women sort of philanthropists who, you see that also a lot up in Boston as well with the saving of the Old South Meeting House, and Mary Hemingway, who was basically donated all the money that was needed to save that site at the last hour. So many of these women who had wealth were using it towards preservation efforts and saving the history. So it is possible that she was a donor. Yeah, I've often gotten the question, like, why do you think women cared so much about preservation? And I feel like that's a hard question to answer because I don't like to stereotype, people's motivations in terms of gender, but I do think that men and women have a different view when it comes to what is sort of passed on to posterity and what things are sort of saved. And I think the fact that you have men and women involved in preservation is essential, obviously, but I think that women often have had a sort of a different perspective. And when I think, for example, about the material culture collection that the Daughters of the American Revolution have down in DC in their museum, and I think about the things in their collection, like quilts and clothing and household items that I don't think men would have thought to save for posterity. Maybe I'm generalizing a little bit, but I'm thankful that the women did save those things because, of course, that reveals so much about everyday life and what life was like in the past in America. So I think the fact that you had men and women involved in early preservation efforts, really is valuable. We all benefit from that because I do see in the research, sort of a different approach as to what men thought was worth saving and what women oftentimes thought was worth saving. And even the perspectives on what stories and how the stories are told too. I've seen, a variety of, a difference, I guess you could say, between the way that men and women have told stories that they pass on. So yeah, I think it was sort of natural that women would get involved in preservation just because of that idea of, women are the educators and they're passing on, to the next generation. So, and the idea too, that so many of the early sites that were saved were homes and historic homes, you do see it sort of as this natural segue from women being concerned with their own house to being sort of housekeepers for the nation. I think that's a chapter, title of one of my chapters, but the nation sort of housekeepers. And then of course that continues on into the progressive era where you see this sense of civic housekeeping and women are pushing for better working conditions and education and things like that. So it's sort of this natural progression from home all the way through preservation and then to more social causes and civic causes in the 20th century. So yeah, I think preservation often is overlooked in that story of social movements. And I think it's a really important one. If there's no other questions or comments, thank you again for coming out and yeah, thank you.